Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be revisiting a case that I know a lot of you, especially true crime fans, will already be familiar with, the Menendez brothers.
Oh yeah, this one's a classic.
It's one of those cases that's really captivated the public for decades, and for good reason, right? I mean, in 1989, we have brothers Lyle and Eric Menendez. They shoot their parents in their Beverly Hills mansion. I mean, just think about that for a second. The brutality of the crime, especially when you consider the family's wealth and this outward appearance of privilege, it's shocking. And I think that's why the question of why continues to linger, even after all these years.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really talk about the Menendez brothers without thinking about that image, right? The Beverly Hills mansion, the wealth, it all just adds another layer to it.
Exactly. And of course, the media initially, they really painted this picture of spoiled rich kids, hungry for their inheritance, especially given, we're talking about a $14 million estate. But just like with so many other high-profile cases, there's way more to uncover beneath the surface here, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I mean, this case is like a textbook example of why context is so important. The court of public opinion, especially back then, it often latched onto these early, simplistic narratives.
Right, because it's easy. It's easy to just take that and run with it.
Right, exactly. But the defense in this case, they presented a very, very different perspective. They argued that Lyle and Eric's actions were born out of desperation after enduring, years of alleged sexual and emotional abuse from their father, Jose Menendez.
Wow. So we're talking about a completely different motive here, then.
Completely. And to add to that, the brothers also claimed that their mother, Kitty, was complicit in this abuse.
Okay, so that changes things dramatically. But if it was so bad, why not just leave? I mean, it's a question I'm sure a lot of people have asked themselves.
You're right, it's a common reaction and an understandable one. But it also highlights how little I think people understood, especially back then, about how abuse really operates, especially within families where you have wealth, power, like the Menendez family. I mean, think about it. Control, fear, manipulation, those become incredibly powerful tools. And escaping a situation like that is so much more complicated than just, packing a bag and walking out the door.
That's a really good point, and it makes you think about just how complex these family dynamics can be. So we have this horrific crime, but we also have these disturbing allegations of abuse that totally change how we view the situation. So what happens when the case goes to trial?
Well, this is where things get even more interesting. The Menendez case, it wasn't just one trial. It was actually two separate trials, which already, that alone ups the stakes.
Right, because now you've got double the pressure, double the scrutiny.
Exactly. And ultimately, both brothers are found guilty and they receive life sentences without parole.
Wow. So you would think that would be the end of it, right? Trial, verdict, justice is served. But that is not where the story ends. Not even close. Decades later, this case is back in a big way, in part because of something that feels very 21st century, Lyle Menendez on TikTok.
Yeah, in 2022, it came out that Lyle Menendez was able to access TikTok from prison. Apparently, they're using tablets for educational purposes.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, right? This is a convicted murderer in one of the most notorious cases of the 90s, and now he's able to, even in a limited way, communicate with the outside world through a platform like TikTok. It's pretty wild.
It really is, and it definitely sparked a massive debate, right? About prisoner access to social media, how these platforms might be used by those who've been convicted, even of violent crimes. I mean, does it give them a platform to kind of explain themselves, potentially even try to sway public opinion? Or does it feel inappropriate, like they're somehow benefiting from, their notoriety?
Yeah, it's a really, really complicated issue, and there's really no easy answers.
No easy answers at all.
It adds this whole other dimension to this case, though, especially for people who might only be familiar with, the headlines. And speaking of new perspectives, I understand that there's been some significant new evidence that's come to light.
Yeah, there has. This is where things get really compelling. So the former cellmate of Lyle's has come forward, and he's claiming that Lyle shared some pretty detailed, very specific accounts of the abuse that he and Eric allegedly suffered.
Okay, so this isn't just vague claims or hearsay. We're talking about that's when you're saying, I heard this directly from Lyle, and these are the specifics.
Exactly. This isn't just, oh yeah, he said his dad was mean to him. This is detailed stuff.
Wow, okay. So we're talking about potential corroboration here of what Lyle and Eric have said all along.
Exactly. And that's why this is so potentially impactful. It's one thing, for the accused to make allegations of abuse, but to have someone else, someone seemingly unconnected to the family, to the case, come forward with details that back up those claims, that carries weight.
It does. It makes you wonder if this information had been available during the original trials, would it have changed anything? Like, would it have even gone differently? And maybe even more importantly, what does this mean for the case moving forward?
I mean, those are the million-dollar questions, right? And I think that's part of the reason why the Menendez case has come roaring back into the public consciousness. I mean, we haven't seen this level of attention to it in decades.
It's like we're watching this whole other chapter unfold in real time, you know?
Exactly. It's definitely raised the question of a retrial. I mean, that's what everyone wants to know, right?
Right. Like, is this new evidence enough to potentially overturn a verdict that's, what, decades old now?
Right. But to understand that, we kind of have to, like, delve into how the legal system actually handles new evidence in cases like this.
Yeah, because I imagine it's not as simple as, oh, look, new information, time for a do-over.
Definitely not. So for new evidence to even be considered for something like a retrial, it has to meet some really specific legal standards. It's not enough for it to just be, new information. It has to be what they call material to the case, meaning it has the potential to have actually changed the outcome of that original trial.
Okay, so in this situation, the defense would basically have to argue that this new witness's corroboration of the abuse is so significant that if the jury had heard it back then, there's a real chance they might have reached a different verdict.
Exactly. Like, it's not just adding details to a story you've already heard. It's like fundamentally changing how we understand the case. And more importantly, the brothers' state of mind, their motivations.
So are they trying to do that? Like, is there an active legal push to use this to try to get a retrial for the Menendez brothers?
They are. They're using this new information, and they filed what are called petitions, asking a higher court to review the case and consider all of this.
Wow, okay. So there is a chance, even if it's a long shot, that Lyle and Eric Menendez might get their day in court again all these years later.
It's possible, but the justice system, it doesn't move quickly.
It's definitely not known for its speed.
No, not at all. So, no guarantees.
Yeah.
But I think even the possibility has reignited this debate, this scrutiny around the case. It's kind of like we're all watching this next chapter unfold, you know?
It's true. It's like this case that we all thought was closed, it refuses to go away quietly.
And there's another layer to this.
Oh, there is.
There is. So, as if we didn't have enough to talk about already, right? We've got social media, new witnesses, but then in 2023, Netflix releases this docuseries, right?
Menendez plus Menudo, Boys Betrayed. I'll be honest, when I first heard that title, I was like, where is this going?
Yeah, it's not what you expect, but it's a whole other layer of complexity to this story. The docuseries, it goes into some allegations that Jose Menendez, the father, was potentially involved in the abuse of members of the band Menudo.
Whoa. Okay, so not only are we dealing with, the alleged abuse of Lyle and Eric, but now there's the possibility that their father was engaged in this pattern of behavior with other boys, even outside the family.
That's the implication, and it's a chilling one. But it's really important to be clear about something. These are still allegations against Jose Menendez. Nothing's been proven in court.
Right, of course. But even as allegations, that's huge. I mean, it makes you wonder, like, how much weight does that add to the claims that Lyle and Eric have made?
Right, and it kind of forces everyone to grapple with this disturbing question. If Jose Menendez was capable of the kind of abuse that's being alleged, does that lend credibility to what his sons have been saying all these years?
It's a lot to wrap your head around, that's for sure. I mean, you're talking about potential years of abuse, the lasting trauma of that, and how all of this might factor into a legal defense.
Absolutely.
And every new piece of information that comes out seems like it just deepens the mystery in a way.
It really does. It's like this case just keeps getting more and more complex the more we learn.
It really does make you think, like, how often do we form opinions about a case or about people based on like just a headline or a soundbite? Right. We don't always have the full story, do we?
We really don't. And it's so easy to kind of like latch on to those early narratives, especially when they're coming from, official sources or the media.
It's human nature, right? We look for patterns, for explanations.
Exactly. We want to make sense of things. But that doesn't always mean we're getting the whole picture. And this case is like a perfect example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned how public opinion has shifted on this case over time, especially with like younger generations seeming a lot more open to hearing the brothers' side of things. Why do you think that is?
I think part of it is just that we're in a different cultural moment. right? There's so much more awareness now about things like trauma, abuse, the long-term effects of those experiences. And people are like more willing to listen to survivors. There's less judgment, you know?
It's like we're finally starting to understand that abuse doesn't discriminate. It can happen in any family, regardless of their income or their social status.
Exactly. And I also think social media has played a role in this too. Like it or not, it's given a voice to people who might not have had one before. So we're getting more perspectives, more sides to the story.
It's like that control over the narrative that traditional media had, it's not as absolute anymore.
Right. And that's not to say that social media is perfect, you know, or that everything on there is accurate, but it's definitely changed the landscape, right? Like it's made it harder to just present one narrative and have everyone accept it as the truth.
For sure. And that brings us back to this idea of like, if the Menendez trials were held today with all this new evidence, with the public being more informed about abuse, about trauma, like, would it even go the same way?
Right. Would the verdict be the same?
Exactly. What do you think?
Honestly, impossible to say for sure. I mean, the justice system it's complex, and even with all we know now, there's no way to predict with certainty how a jury would interpret everything, how they'd weigh the different factors.
It's a question that'll probably be debated for years to come.
Probably.
We started this deep dive with a question that's been asked ever since this case first made headlines. Why? Why would two young men, seemingly with everything going for them, commit such a brutal act? And even though we may never have a definitive answer, like I think we've gained a much deeper understanding of the circumstances, the complexities, all those different layers that led up to that fateful night.
We've gone way beyond the headlines with this one.
We definitely have. And that's what I think is so important about these deep dives, right? It's not just about rehashing the details of a crime. It's about trying to understand the why, the human element, the things that maybe led up to that point.
Absolutely. And I think for me, at least, it's a good reminder to like stay curious, keep asking questions, and to be open to, you know, different perspectives, even if they challenge our initial assumptions. Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into the Menendez brothers case. Hopefully it's left you with some things to think about, maybe even sparked some interesting conversations. As always, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
See you then.